Hi, everyone, and welcome to this fifth gathering as part of the Provocations, Conversations, Iterations series at SlowMoco. To provide a little context, this project began a couple of years ago when we launched an open call for provocations on the question of what escapes computation in interactive performance. And we've been collecting provocations ever since. They live online, but what we wanted to do this year as part of the extended format of the Conference on Movement and Computing, SlowMoco, is to bring some of the provocateurs, those who have submitted provocations, together to discuss their provocations, to look at relationships between them, to look at differences that matter in their perspectives as artists and scholars. So this ongoing series of curated conversations is organized by Jessica Rajko, John MacCallum, and myself, Teoma Naccarato. And we are thrilled to have here with us today as provocateurs, Dawn Stoppiello, Muindi Fanuel Muindi, and Ian Heisters. So we're going to invite each of the provocateurs to reflect back on their provocations briefly and then open into conversation. And Dawn, I will turn it over to you.
Hello. Yeah, okay, so I'm not going to read mine word for word because I'd rather just sort of synopsize what I was talking about. And what I wondered about was how the interactive tool, I'll just call it that for now, the interactive tool gets chosen by the artist who's going to make a work using it. Because my experience with interactive tools has taught me that every tool comes with a kind of built-in choreographic approach because of the way that the tool functions. And so the question then for me is sort of, do you choose the tool because you want to see a certain kind of choreography? And I'm using choreography because I'm a dancer and choreographer. Do you choose the tool because you want to see and create a certain kind of movement? Or are you given a tool or have opportunity to work with a tool, and therefore your choreography comes from that exploration? And there's no hierarchy, there's just a question around that. Although there is also a hierarchy, because sometimes there's the notion that the tool, the interactive computational system is the fabulous thing, and then whatever gets made for it is sort of secondary, and that's something we can discuss. So I guess that's my question, is about what is the embedded meaning of the use of a specific tool to the work that it's being made for? Because another thing I've learned is that there are metaphors built into these things. If you're wearing a costume, it's a parasite. If you're moving in front of cameras, there's surveillance, you know. So kind of what is all of that? How do those things get chosen? And how do artists learn to play them? And I use the term play, that's a long time useful word for me. So maybe is that enough of a launch? Okay. I'd be curious to hear responses around that.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think I was slated to go second here. And my question was around, you know, what it is that that computation does, or at least another way of phrasing it, which is it processes information in a particular way. And thinking about information and the etymology of that word made me think about another word, transformation. And I wanted to relate the two together. And so I thought of a really low-tech example here of information processing, which is just, you know, if an animal walks by, it leaves an imprint, it literally leaves a form, it informs the ground by leaving its footprint there. And in many ways, you know, it leaves that print there, but that's also, you know, it does that as an act of transformation. It's also transforming the space. And so I wanted to think about how information is kind of what's left behind as a kind of residue or mark or trace, but the transformation is an act that kind of precedes, exceeds, and succeeds the leaving behind of the trace. And so, you know, the coyote was passing through, if it's a coyote, it's passing through your yard before it leaves the print, it's passing as it leaves the print, and it continues after. And so I wanted to think about the relationship between the full scope of the action the act of passing, and then just the trace that's left behind. And it seems to me that computation is always dealing with that trace, and then, you know, either trying to look back and see what happened in retrospect, or to look forward and anticipate what will happen after the fact. But there's a whole realm of activity that's kind of not captured there. And I was trying to also think of, you know, how it is we get at that realm of activity. And one way I was thinking about it was how emotion, in many ways, allows us to go beyond just thinking about things in retrospect or as prospects for the future, and allows us to kind of situate ourselves and kind of feel something ongoing. I don't want to really say present, because like I said, the Coyotes Act kind of like has this capacity to go backward, forward, and exist as an ongoing thing. And so that's kind of like my question is, insofar as computation is an information processing mechanism, or, you know, a way of processing information, and, you know, a new way, perhaps. Emotion is a very old way. And so I'm wondering, is there, you know, how does one deal with emotion, you know, in the context of this new form of information processing, and yeah, I'll leave it at that.
So much to ask about those first two, but I'll just go ahead and talk about mine. So originally, a couple of years ago, I proposed this provocation that, kind of like something that Dawn touched on in hers, of like, what's the embedded meaning in these tools and why do we choose them? And problematizing the computer as a non-neutral choice, as a biased choice, like a gun. Computers were built for building targeting, like the earliest computers were targeting systems for torpedoes in World War II. And they were used to crack. Turing famously invented was able to break the Enigma code using some of the first computers, again, for a purpose of war. And the legacy of computers is continued from there, from that birth in war. I mean, like just yesterday, I was talking with another group about the fact that computer languages are all written in English, and how this promotes colonialism and specifically American power into other cultures that have to learn English and learn American English in order to use and build with computers. So that's where I was coming from a couple of years ago, but more recently I've been looking at this. So, well, and I frame that in the terms of history, like the history of a computer escapes the computation and the performance because we choose to leave that out. And why do we make that choice to ignore that legacy? But more recently, I've been thinking about history and its personal dimension of memory. And how computers, and this very much gets into what Muindi starts to talk about, is like how computers erase memory, and that this is a deliberate tactic of techno-capitalist companies that are building computers, and the computers they are choosing to build, the algorithms they are choosing to research, that then we are repurposing as artists, avoid memory. Like for instance, I'll use the example of like Uber creating this kind of placeless, timeless transaction with a driver whose name you may not ever know, and using that to disrupt a local economy of service drivers that you might have personal relationships with. Or Amazon Fresh, again, they do everything they can to remove your personal memory of the people you're dealing with behind this system. And they're using it to disrupt a local economy of grocers in that case, which are like, a grocer in a market is historically really the keystone of a community in a lot of ways. And so these companies are erasing memory in order to disrupt economies and centralize wealth from all over the world. Uber is pulling wealth from local driving economies and centralizing it in their offices, and I think in Manhattan or something like that. And so as artists, why do we continue to choose? So I think this word escapes computation. I want to question because it's not, escapes as a passive. And I want to say we're deliberately leaving it out because we want to pretend these computers are neutral. And we want to pretend these computers are tools, but they're not. They have these embedded meanings. And to ignore that is to propagate the power of the corporations that have built the computers, because we're playing along with their game.
Yeah. I feel like we've got 3 levels going on here. We've got like this deep political, socio-political kind of embedded stuff inside computation. Then we have like sensation and presence and trace. And then we have me just asking like real practical questions, but they're not disconnected really. They're fully connected. And I think what you were just saying, Ian, is really interesting because I spend most of my time these days introducing like 19-year-olds to what it means to play with software like Isadora, right? And in my last 4 years at USC, I have banned the word cool from my classroom because that's all they do. They go, oh, cool. And I say, well, what comes right after cool? Anything? Because if it's just cool, you can leave now. Because what are your questions as artists? And I think that gets right. Well, because Ian, what you're talking about is super deep and very difficult to impart on a 19-year-old in an hour and 20 minutes when I'm also trying to make art and think about art. But I try to get them to think about what are their questions about why they would use a computer versus a pencil or a pen, and what are they talking about? Because in the 80s and early 90s, or the late 80s, early 90s, we were just fresh on the internet. We had a lot of anxiety and curiosity about surveillance and about showing up as different personalities on the computer, and what did that mean, and how many selves could we show ourselves as? Like those kinds of things were really happening in that moment. That's not happening so much anymore, but I don't know what the questions are that artists are asking, because I think of art as an act of resistance. And so what are they resisting? That's one thing. Also, we used to say, if you see something on Star Trek, the military is already doing it. Right? Maybe, I don't know, that's true.
So one of the questions I had, and I like that your provocation is practical, like, because there is a very practical question of what are the institutional changes? You're an educator. What are the changes that need to be made? Like you're saying earlier, you said, oh gosh, it's escaping me at the moment, but something about the embedded meaning. Oh, and so often the tool is, the coolness of the tool is the end unto itself, right, in our work, right? And I mean, I feel like even as artists, a lot of us have adopted this framing of like I got criticized once for a piece from other artists because like it didn't have a fluid simulation in it, because fluid simulations are cool and they look pretty.
Yeah.
But like,
yeah,
why is this bias towards the shiny, towards the cool? Why is it in working with technology? And also like, why have we even like bought into that? Like, why have a lot of artist communities bought into that?
So that's actually what made me try and use a really low-tech example and try and like say, okay, let's not talk about the computer, but let's talk about these 2 different levels that you could be on, where you could be on the level of information, which I think, as you were saying, Ian, there's this weird thing of kind of erasing history. And Walter Benjamin has an essay called The Storyteller, which I'm sure you guys have read, which is like, he like makes that exact point where what information does is like erase a sort of like embodied experience of wisdom. And then, there's this element of storytelling that has to like invoke an emotion, provoke an action, situate things, and kind of move somebody to do, say, think differently, or to bring something new to somebody else. And so I was thinking about that like level, and that's why I wanted to talk about with like a really low tech example where, you know, I don't think anybody would be satisfied if we could just produce prints of coyotes everywhere and no longer need to produce coyotes. We don't want just a trace. What we want is we want this kind of like experienced knowledge that this thing is in the world. And so I really want to like think about these, like, why are these information tools cool is another thing that I keep wondering. I'm still very curious about why like this has become cool, and there's lots of, and you know, I think emotional problems have perhaps become less cool, and technical problems are more cool, and I wonder about that.
Yeah, I think about why we get so excited when we can like wave our arms in the air and make the lights go on, or, you know, wave our arms in the air and make sound happen. It's this kind of weird magic, I guess, is a word I return to a lot. But also, Muindi, what I'm thinking about with what you're saying is this notion of presence. And I've thought about this a lot, and I still keep coming up really short on what presence actually is, even. You know, yeah.
I also have a follow-up for Ian, because when I first read your provocation, you know, one of the things that struck me was, you know, not just the origins of computers in their kind of like wartime context, but then like you mentioned in your provocation, the material sourcing of the materials that go into the computers. And, you know, I have like a kind of like personal and like emotional relationship here, because most of my mother's family is from the Congo. They no longer live there. They live in Tanzania for various reasons. But, you know, that is a place where I think 70% of, you know, 70% of certain minerals that are put in computers came from, at least for quite a long time. And, you know, these are, you know, it's essential. Essentially, the country has been essential to the computing economy in a way that's kind of totally invisible, because you think of computers, you think of Silicon Valley, but you don't think of these places which produce all of the necessary components that allow these information pieces to flow. And so I was also thinking about how, you know, it doesn't just erase like the history of its own production, but also like the history of, you know, its maintenance and sustenance and its resourcing, which is, I think, a really strange thing. And thinking about Dawn's kind of practical question, the question then is, if you use the computer, what do you know, how do you acknowledge that in any kind of way? Or if you choose not to acknowledge it, like, is that like a choice that you have to acknowledge as well? So.
Think about this. We talk about this in my house a lot. It's really hard to live your values fully, right? Like how I remember when I first moved to Portland years ago, I volunteered at the co-op up the street, and they had a sign on the wall. It was like the kind of hierarchy of corporate ownership, right? Like you think you're drinking a cool Dasani water or whatever, and it's owned by Coca-Cola, you know, that kind of structure. And I think that's what I'm feeling right now, is like the embedded history of every single product I use, every single choice I make, every single act has connotations, and how far can I go with that, you know, to be truly living my values. And I cheat all the time, constantly. And then I recognize that I'm cheating, and then I get frustrated and figure out, well, how far can I go? You know, but it takes work. It takes effort to understand, or it takes someone like having this conversation to know that those minerals come from the Congo, and that there's a repercussion of extracting those minerals from that location, right? And like, so like, is that the class I should be teaching? You know, how was your computer built? Let's go there. You know, that's not a bad idea, actually.
So I think there's a difference, though. Like, there are a lot of these personal compromises we make. My son is 6 years old, and we talk about this all the time, because he wants to be really good for the planet. And like he doesn't want us to eat any meat. And I say, well, yeah, we eat very little meat, but like I have to fight with you to eat shrimp and mussels and tofu, which are the things that are sustainable to eat. And so like, are you willing to make that compromise? Like you love spaghetti, but spaghetti's made out of beef.
Right.
And so I've been thinking a lot about these compromises we make at a personal level, but I want to distinguish that from the choices we make as artists. And that like, I think we just need to be more thoughtful about it. And one of the questions I'm coming to in my own practice recently, I've been doing a lot of work with neural networks, and I've been searching for like investigating this very question. And I question whether there's any, like, after you take away the cool, is there anything left? Is there any reason that I should be using neural networks as an artist, or I mean, because they're built for these purposes. Like the neural network I'm using right now is used by self-driving car companies to synthesize driving data for cars so that they can train their AI cars faster, right? Which turns out that's really useful because I can hack it and feed in information about a dancer and synthesize deep fakes of dancers doing dances they never did, which is hilarious and cool. But is there anything else there, or does the technology kind of take it? Is the corruption of the technology so complete that like there's nothing left over? I mean, really, should I go to painting and poetry because those forms are free of this legacy?
You know, I'm thinking about this in some ways because I think that there are ways in which, you know, the existence of computation and its adoption as a social form in many ways have like created all sorts of repercussions that have, you know, that now make things that seemed simple, like, you know, going to the grocer, now going to the grocer, you don't have cash, everything's deposited into an electronic account. You're going to go there and you're going to swipe a card, you know? And so I feel like a lot of things have been like really drawn into the computation realm in such a way that, you know, there's this desire, there's oftentimes a desire to go back to, you know, a material that is less compromised in a certain sense, in which allows you, I think a kind of like really true authenticity of relations to it. But then I think there's, and this goes back to what Dawn was saying, there's this like real inauthenticity of everyday life that's kind of mediated through these systems, visions, and images. And I don't know how to, you know, because I don't know what the goal is for me when it comes to, you know, trying to produce a more authentic emotional kind of connection, but also in some way trying to mediate this other world that is there. And I don't know if art should be an escape or should be like a merging, or I think that's like the question that becomes to me is like, now that we live in a computerized computational world where computation facilitates so much of our life, how can one make art without, in some way, that's a form of resistance, without in some way touching on computation or using it? But then it's how do you use it is the question, and I don't know. These are all big questions for me.
But then I feel like the interrogation of the computation, it's necessary, but it starts to consume everything. And sometimes I love photography. And that it uses technology. It's dependent on technology, but the form has escaped the technology. Like, and I feel like can working with computation escape its and just to make art about other things, like stop making art about how screwed up this whole system is.
No, I totally think about that a lot. This like, you know, like I can use blue paint just to make blueness, or I could use blue paint to like make a comment about the history of paint. Like, I don't even know if that's a thing one would comment on, but I totally feel what you're saying about this, you know, and this is exactly the question. I'm like, because I honestly, I mean, I was so up to my nose hairs in computers for many, many, many years, making art, asking these questions that during those decades that I was doing it felt really important to be asking as an artist. What Muindi's saying is exactly what I'm feeling now. Like, I mean, it's just everywhere. That computer, at least in my, you know, first world, Portland, Oregon-y world, it's everywhere. And I don't know that it's, no, I was going to say, I don't know that it's necessary, and that's not the right language, because it is necessary. Some artists need to make comments on the system and some don't, and that's fine. But I feel like what Ian's saying is like, can you even use these kinds of systems without automatically be questioning them, or I don't know if it's a question, but without making them their history and their way of kind of controlling us as in society part of the message that you're making. Like, can you do that? Can you use a neural network to make a piece about, you know, funny dancers? Yes, obviously you can. But are you asking, like, why would I? Right? Like, why would I? Maybe it's because that's what you're facile with. Those are the materials that you know how to manipulate well. You know, because I think about that too. Like, I can't crochet at all. Terrible. You know, it's not my go-to. But and so like making stuff with these sort of software is sort of where, and my body is just where I landed and what I was interested in and good at. But yeah, I still don't know what, like, do you guys have interaction with artists that are using computer systems that are like 19 right now? And are they doing, because they're so saturated with like TikTok and Instagram and all that fast, cool, image. Are there some that are looking deeper, digging deeper, being curious about all the stuff that we're touching on today? Is that happening or is it not happening? That's a question I don't know. It's not happening in my world. I feel responsible for that a little bit, which is why I'm now going to do a class on how was your computer built. I'm not kidding. We're going to do that one day at least.
You know, and I think this goes back to your provocation, Dawn, where you're saying that, you know, somebody makes a choice to play a guitar, and, you know, they might not even be good at playing a guitar when they start, but they make a choice and then they develop, you know, skills, habits, patterns, talents for it. And it seems, and I'm wondering if, you know, if your question is perhaps a really deep question here, because there are many other instruments, but it seems like the instrument of the computer as an interactive instrument is one that has a strong pull for reasons that are economic, and then all for reasons that are kind of also cultural. Like, there's like cultural capital in being able to do something not just with paint, but with paint and a computer.
Right.
And so I'm wondering, you know, is it being forced on us, that choice of, you know, when is a computer a forced choice and when is it the actual medium of facility for the artists doing the work is a good question.
Well, and Ian brought up in his provocation at some point this idea of privilege too, and who kind of gets to and who doesn't get to. And thinking about that with what you're saying right now is like, yeah, you know, I remember when I was at Cal Arts, Mark was the only person at the school with a computer in his dorm room. One person in 800. And that's so not the case anymore. And so it was like a specialty item, right? And now it's not. And there are some good things about that, but there are some maybe other things, like you're saying, it's being forced into our faces more. I don't know. I feel like we could go on. and on and on.
Wow, there's so much material here. I think there's been an interesting sort of reconfiguring of the question of what escapes computation into how do we escape computation? And something really important coming up about this question of choice and how do we understand the sort of context in which choice is being made, or the boundaries around a choice, or what we perceive as a choice of instrument or tool, and what doesn't even seem available because it's not within our frame, or it's not within our sort of notion of what has constituted that tool historically, geographically, etc.
Yeah, I mean, I like this. Like, what escapes computation? Well, we would like to. We do.
Nothing does.
Like to.
But yeah, it's funny. When I was glancing through some other provocations, somebody's answer to what escapes computation was almost everything, and I really resonate with that, because as a dancer working in system suits and whatever, you know, any kind of sensory system that's reading the body is an enormous reduction of what the body is actually expressing. So on one sense, computation misses almost everything. But in our sense that we've been discussing today, is computation misses nothing. You cannot escape it. I love that kind of conundrum.
Mm.
I think, so that's one reason I've always wanted to work with dance and computation, is because dance is such a wonderful foil to computation. Because, I mean, what escapes computation? Dance does. Like, dance is of any form is probably the hardest for the computer to understand and is most reduced by the computer's attempts.
Yeah.
And that's a really interesting contrast to work with.
Yeah.
So this is an amazing range of hugely provocative perspectives, and I think this is a good moment to wrap it up. There's so much more to say, but we will continue our discussions online and in upcoming events. And a huge thank you to the three of you for joining us today.
Oh my gosh.
Thank you so much for putting this together.
Yeah, thanks. It was great to chat with you guys. Very nice.
Yeah.
Thank you.